So in this picture, it's very like stylized version of the actual images that I used for the actual piece. So I think it's quite interesting to see like the jumps that I've made. And so I suppose this kind of session is about finding ways to like make connections between like very different image sources, because sometimes you'll have a picture that you want to do and you might have a really nice photo, but say you maybe want to kind of bring in a figure or something else that isn't in the original picture. But like if you kind of think about the ways that you can kind of create, I don't know, uniformity, I suppose, through the different techniques, like just kind of bring things together, you can sort of create a piece that looks like everything's kind of part of the same image, even if they're all from completely different sources and you've kind of made this sort of composite composition. But yeah, so I actually made this on a sort of just very much a square piece of paper like this, and I actually then cut out the circle. So yeah, don't worry about being like not neat enough or anything, because you can very much just go around it with a protractor, just to kind of get that perfect circle. Let's get cracking. Has everyone got their water and their various brushes, and yeah, your kitchen towels, very useful in this one. For this picture, I basically wanted to use things like our wet on wet technique, which we used mainly in the first week, to kind of create this feeling of movement and swimming through water. And then I also kind of brought in more like kind of more detailed lines through sort of using the wet on dry technique. And then I kind of really played around with like how I could sort of create the feeling of water by just letting the watercolor sort of do its thing. But the first step that we're going to be doing is just making this nice red that kind of connects these three fish mainly. And we are going to be using the wet on wet technique to kind of get in. I mean, this fish was the one that I really focused on because I wanted to give the feeling of a really detailed front and then this more sweepy background. So I basically started off my picture by mixing up a red. So using your big brush, basically just get some red on your palette. That's the one next to the blue, and a bit of orange and a bit of brown, and just start to mix up a nice deep red. You won't need much orange really, but if you find it's looking a little bit too sort of pinky, just add that in. Add in a bit of orange as well as the brown. But I find that, yeah, you get quite a nice like rich browny red if you just use that red and that brown together. We're going to be painting it onto, I would say like not too wet, but we are going to do a little bit of cleaning our, well, adding some clean water before we apply this. So, I mean, you can kind of see that I have used quite a lot of pigment in the picture, certainly for the main fish, but then we're going to water it down a bit for the other fish. But so once you've kind of got your pinky red, deep pinky red ready, we're going to do a bit of selective application of clean water to our fish. So basically, really, you only want to apply, we're just going to be tracing in these bits of red here and here and here. So that's the only areas I'm really going to focus on putting water on, and I'm going to put it around them as well so that the paint can sort of merge out into the blue a bit. So yeah, just with your fan brush, because we've got this one red already. So just go for the clean brush. Just paint some water over the top of the areas that we're going to be painting red. So yeah, basically just all the areas that you can see red in, just roughly paint over the top. So I'm not really painting in the top half of my circle, just because there's not really any red in that area. I mean, I always say, like, start really faint if you're completely unsure of where you're going to go with the piece, because it allows you to sort of make those mistakes. But so I've got my red to hand, and we're going to start by just adding onto your really nice wet page the key lines for the fish, this big one. And you'll find that when you apply the paint, it's, you know, it's onto this wet surface, so it's already like bleeding out. But you might actually want to go in and add a little bit more water, just so that it really bleeds out nicely. Because as you can see with this, I've really loaded up a lot of paint there to make it really dark, but I've also had a very wet page to start with. So even though it's very blurred out, because I've added quite a lot of pigment, it's still quite powerful. So yeah, I'm just going to kind of go over mine and add even more water. And then you can just go in again with the red. And then just use this to map out the kind of key lines around your big red fish, but make sure that you leave out some of the, not all of the body is filled in. It's only really the outlines, because I wanted to have that contrast and that feeling of the light hitting the side of its body. You can see in the pictures that I sent, it's a rainbow trout. So I wanted to give that feeling of like the slight sheen of the fish. Sort of, they have very like iridescent scales, and obviously I went for this kind of more limited color palette, but I still wanted to have a bit of that that feeling of it. And you'll find that, yeah, the color will start to bleed a bit, which I always am a big fan of. And so I'm just really roughly like tracing in, yeah, mainly just like the front of the fish, a bit of its fin. And I've also actually just traced in the side of this other fish that's poking into the corner with its face. And I've just kind of suggested the eye, but you don't need to worry too much about those details, because we are going to kind of go in there with some more details in a bit. And once you've got your main fish painted in, you might then want to just add a bit of water to your current red, and maybe a little bit more orange and a bit more brown, just so that it's a slightly paler and a bit warmer color. And you can just use that to really roughly paint in the body of this fish. So you'll see that I have done it really roughly. I've, you know, missed out bits on the tail. I've kind of haven't filled it up right to the lines. I wanted it to be quite loose, and yeah, just really nicely diluted down so that it's not too, so that it feels like it's further back and less detailed than the one that we've just done. And just make it really nice and diluted down so that you can't really see the brush strokes. And again, it doesn't matter if you sort of go over the lines, because well, I just don't think it ever matters. I feel, you know, at school you're always taught to color in between the lines, but I think there's always, well, unless you're doing a super hyper real picture, which is very difficult to do in watercolor, and I personally don't think is really necessary. But then maybe that's because I like doing quite messy, unrealistic things. I'm probably not very good at doing very realistic things in watercolor. It's a very skillful thing to be able to do. But I definitely think, yeah, to get that really expressionistic feeling, don't bother too much about coloring in the lines. And just to show you how mine's looking. So you can see it's very wet. I'm kind of having to be a bit careful with not tilting it too much, but the paint is seeping out a bit into the outskirts that I've put in. And you might also just want to bring in a bit of that more diluted red onto your main fish, just to like bring in another color. But once you've done that, we're basically going to create some shadows in our fish now. So really, we're just gonna, well, you can see on the picture, we've kind of got these dark areas alongside the reds, like on the bit of the tail, kind of on the underside, around, just sort of like picking out little bits of darker areas. And the way that we're going to do that is just adding some of our dark blue and our dark green to our red. You might need to mix up a bit more red. But so this dark blue, so the one next to the red, and then also this dark green, which is just the one next to the blue. So you really don't want too much. But as with, well, all color mixing, just you never need that much. Well, the darker color you always use less of, because there's just more pigment in it, and it's just a more overpowering color. The green is the key player in this, I would say. But I've now added a bit of blue as well, and it's looking really nice and inky. And I'm basically going to add that in just to suggest a bit more shadow. The top of the body, these sort of shadowy bits, the little bit of the head. And if you're finding it starting to get a bit, especially on the top fish, you want it to still be nice and wet, so that it is kind of going to blend in with your with the red that you've already got. So just try and keep it nice and wet if it's not already. So like you'll find that because you're painting onto the wet surface, just makes this really nice, like blotchy, like you can kind of see these colors are starting to meld together really nicely. And I'm going to kind of bring some more water in there so that it's not so separated, if you see what I mean. Because yeah, I mean, I do think painting fish is so fun in watercolor, because you really can use the medium to suggest exactly, well, the wateriness of them. But you can also, yeah, bring in some darker lines onto your little tiny fish in the far right hand corner as well. I've also just brought in some darker shadows in the front of the face, and you might find that as your paper is starting to dry a bit, it's also allowing you to kind of create a bit more sharper lines. So you can kind of see I've got a bit of detail already in the face just by bringing in some shadows as well. But yeah, so the next step is bringing in a new color. So I basically have details in various colors in this picture, but the next I wanted to create kind of a bit of a mix up of styles, I suppose. I sort of have this very impressionistic fish, but then I also wanted to create almost a slightly cartoony feel for this one. And the way that I did that was just by, like with the giraffe, having like a line, like a specific line to show the features that isn't sort of painted over and layered like in some of the other ones. And so I basically just wanted to, yeah, just give a bit of variety, but also bring in some purple to this fish and, like, you know, a touch on this tail, and yeah, just basically bringing in the little features, like this little guy here. I've pretty much only done with this purpley color. And to make the purple, you just need some of your pink, which is the one next to the orange. So that really nice bright pink. And then a touch of your dark blue, or your light blue, actually. You can get really nice purples with both. And then some white. And that will make a really nice lilac-y color. If you're finding it's a bit too pink, like mine is, I'm just going to add a little bit of, I'm actually going to add a little bit of my cerulean blue, just to, which is the pale blue. And yeah, that's made a really nice lilac. And also you can kind of have maybe a bit more pinky one, a bit more of a bluey one for these different areas. But you're going to be wanting to use your small brush for this bit. I'm actually going to use my big brush, but really for no reason other than I can't actually see my small brushed hand, and I have very good control through years of practice, but I would recommend using your big brush. I mean, no, small brush. But basically you just want to use this, and because I'm painting onto, well, just to trace in your outline, and because I'm painting onto a very dry surface, because I didn't put the water on the top. So you'll find that it's a really nice clean line. And so, yeah, just draw in those features that you can see. And once you've drawn in the main lines, you can also dilute your paint down a bit, and then start to bring in a bit of shading. So, you know, we've got a little bit of shading on this top here. We've got a bit of shading watered down on here, just a suggestion on that tail. Yeah, we've got a bit of on here. And you'll find that that makes it a little bit less cartoony as well, because I didn't want the styles to be completely opposing. And I made a slightly more pinky version, which I'm also kind of bringing in as well, because I just thought, you know, the more the merrier, as with all color, especially when they're all of the same kind of tonal range, because they're made with the same colors, so they just sort of go together nicely, but it just creates a bit of variation as well. And I might even make a slightly more bluey one as well, you know, just to sort of bring in another bit of interest. And for the kind of main body of the big fish at the top, I really just cleaned my brush pretty much and added a very small amount of paint to it, and just sort of filled it in so that it's very much like an almost white, but just with a hint of color, just because I didn't want it to be completely white. I wanted it to have a bit of something. And I've actually kind of gone in a bit strong on mine. I'm going to take a bit of that off with a bit of tissue paper. And I do quite like it actually when you do go in a bit strong and then you have to dab back, because I think sometimes there is something to be said about adding too much color and then almost having to take it away, because I think it's quite nice because it sort of has that strength that the initial color that you put on has, but then sort of obviously brought back. And I do find that's quite a good technique sometimes. Well, I've actually just gone in on my main fish and it was a bit dry. So I just got my brush wet again, just went in with some clean water, and then I'm going in again just so that the purple wasn't just, you know, a really clean line. I want it to blend in with the other kind of colors that I've got there. And I'm bringing in some lilac to the tip of the tail as well of that big fish. Just kind of anywhere that I want to sort of bring out more of the highlight. I'm going to put some in the eye, a bit on the forehead. I mean, you can never really have too much purple, can you? And so once you've done that, you've kind of got your main fish like painted in. So this is what mine looks like. So our next step is to bring in the background, which is this very watery color, this sort of turquoisey bluey color. And we're going to use that to sort of bring everything together, and then we're going to go in again. And it will, in parts where there's maybe it's a bit wet, it might merge a bit with the fish. So we're then going to have to kind of go in and sort of back in with the other colors. But that's fine, because it's all, again, like with pretty much every single one of our pictures we've done, it's all about sort of push and pull. So you want to be using your light blue and a bit of dark green to create your turquoisey blue. And I'm actually going to put a tiny bit of my other blue in as well, just to sort of make this really nice, dark, watery blue. But you'll see that in my picture, there are sort of multiple different types of blue. So you just really want something that's going to be that nice turquoisey base to start with. And I've actually kind of used a bit of my purple, my lilac, just because it's sort of blended on my palette. I'm quite liking that. So, but then I'm going to add a lot of water, because we can always make certain areas darker. We want to start off quite watery so that the paint will sort of act of its own accord and create this really watery effect. But once you've mixed up your blue, you just need to start to paint it in around your fish, and just make sure to not necessarily paint right up to the edge. It's quite nice to have a bit of the white of the page sort of shining through. And particularly with the top one, I really didn't want the blue to intrude too much into the body of the fish. So I really did try and paint around that. And it should be okay, because you've sort of kept it quite dry anyway, because we didn't paint it wet to start with. So the colors shouldn't merge too much. But yeah, I just want this really watery base layer that I can then go in with and get more sort of variation. And just keeping it really wet, like every kind of other brush stroke, pretty much, I'm getting more fresh water and just adding it in so that it's a really nice watery consistency. and might want to go and just get more water onto that. Just sort of bringing in some water. So you don't want it to be drying before you're done with the water. So, wait, sorry, that's a bit confusing. We're obviously painting water, using water. That's what I mean by we don't want to be done with painting the water until, yeah, we want to keep the water wet that we're painting it with to paint the water. But yeah, so I've basically done this first layer. But yeah, once you've kind of got your base and it's really nice and watery, just start to bring in some more pigmented areas. So maybe add a bit of green so that it's really nice and turquoisey, and just bring that into some bits around the fish so that they really sort of pop out. So, you know, and because it's you're painting into this very wet area, you will find that it really splurges out, and that's what you want. Like, you don't want to be painting it on and it just sort of staying where you put it. You want it to have that real kind of feeling that watercolor, that only really watercolor can bring, of this sort of seeping, yeah, this kind of seeping effect, and just let it sort of spread out of its own accord. Maybe tide it along by adding in a little bit more water. It will be very, very watery. And as well as adding a bit more green, I'm also going to add a bit more of my darker blue, because you can see here I've made this really nice sort of cobalty ultramarine color that I've just brought under this the end of the fish, just to sort of really highlight it, because I suppose I didn't put too much detail on the actual fish, so I wanted to give a feeling of the actual yeah, the base of that, and really sort of, even though it's obviously floating in water, I wanted it to be grounded. So sometimes just by sort of adding a shadow underneath something, you can create this feeling of it being grounded and or suspended in space. And I've mixed that dark blue with a bit of the light blue as well, just to sort of make it that really nice. I suppose it's maybe more cobalt than ultramarine. If you're finding that the paper, you want it to maybe not merge into your fish too much, just use your tissue paper to sort of dab off some of the color, or some of the water. So again, like, you know, you can always take the water away if it's going a bit too extreme. But once you've got that in, you really just want to sort of, well, it's really the kind of finishing flourishes. And as well as just maybe using a bit of your red to sort of darken up any patches that you might want to darken, or, you know, bringing in some lilac again, and bringing some of your, maybe trying to bring in a bit of definition, which will only really be, you might want to sort of wait for it to dry a little bit and then kind of go in with more color once it has dried. So you may well, this is definitely one where you'll probably have to kind of come back, because obviously we have made this background so wet. But you can, when it is a bit more dry, start to bring in some really defining marks. And you might find that because you haven't worked for a while on your main fish, that's where you can sort of start to just again bring in some of those defining parts. And I actually used white really for my main features. You know, I used a bit of dark red to sort of get this really defined flick of the fin, but I also mixed up a white and just used that to kind of bring in that hint of the eye, that bit around the gill. Yeah, just sort of very specific areas. I wanted to have a really defined face so that then it would really contrast with the much more like watery, blendy tail to give that feeling of movement. And just contrasting those really helps to give that, well, it just sort of emphasizes both aspects more. So yeah, once it is dry, you can bring your little brush in and just create those little flicks of white. And I'm actually also going in again with more red, just so that my tail blends with the blue that I have here. So like, oh gosh, sorry, mine's all running all over each other. But you see what I mean? At this bit, I want to darken so that I really get the feeling of the tail sort of swishing through the water.